Hello, I'm a fraudster, and I'm going to scare the living daylights out of more than 1 in 5 of you. Your online password is...
Adding numbers, capitals and symbols makes your password stronger.
To kick off, I'm very happy to be joined from the studio in Oxford by Peter Hitchens. One of the UK's best-known newspaper columnists, Peter is a former Trotskyist firebrand turned conservative commentator who now writes for the Daily Mail. He's the author of numerous books, including, most pertinently to this discussion, The Rage Against God, How Atheism Led Me to Faith, which is in part a response to his brother Christopher's book, God is Not Great. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Peter, it's become quite the fashion in recent years to write and publish books mocking God and ridiculing religious people. What do you think has motored this phenomenon?
Well, a lot of the motivation was money, I think, when Richard Dawkins did so well with his God delusion. I think a lot of other people thought that this was a good way of making money out of publishing. Who can blame them? Let God make them rich.
Do you think beyond the money aspect, do you think it speaks to social trends, a kind of anti-religious sentiment, a relativism possibly?
I don't know about relativism. I think what there definitely is a very strong belief among people of a certain generation, and that's really the under 35s, that they have total autonomy and sovereignty over their own bodies, and they resent greatly any idea that that might not be so. And the principal challenge to this belief is, of course, the religious belief that your sovereignty is limited by a higher power. And if you refuse to acknowledge that power, then you can imagine yourself to be totally sovereign. But again, the argument is mainly, it seems to me, about sex and drugs, and to a certain extent about rock and roll. People have become not just selfish, we've always been selfish, but they've become positive about being selfish. People actually believe that being selfish is a good, justifiable, normal way of life, and they deeply resent being told anything different, and therefore religion is their principal obstacle and opponent.
So would you say there's a liberatory aspect to the new atheism in the sense that they want to wriggle free of rules and strictures imposed by others?
Yes, and like all liberations, it tends to be fairly thoughtless about the long-term implications of this. Obviously, there is a liberation. There have been liberations of the human spirit going on in our world ever since the Great Paris riots of May 1968. People have been under the impression they've been liberating themselves. They've liberated themselves from all kinds of old-fashioned ideas of how to dress, how to behave, how to eat, how to live. And they have later on discovered that in the course of liberating themselves, they've loaded different sorts of chains upon themselves from ones that they got rid of. And that, I think, is the argument that is really raised by this whole issue.
One thing you wrote about in Rage Against God is the fact that lots of these so-called new atheists are very shrill, and in fact they're often more rigid than religious people, particularly in their attitudes to those who disagree with them. What do you think is behind that?
I think there's a certain intolerant fury that they have. It is interesting that if people have adopted this view, they are actively infuriated by the continued existence of anybody who says anything different. I think there probably was a time in the history of the Christian religion when you could have said the same of the Christian religion. It wouldn't tolerate even the slightest deviation. The difference between the two is the Christian religion has learnt that it cannot behave like that and acknowledges that it was wrong to behave like that. The atheist utopian idealist continues to believe that his or her view is still so right that it must be, how shall I put this, it must be triumphant in all areas, and that any expression at all of any different view is actively, as I say, infuriating and to be stamped out. I do find this very much. There's great rage. That's why I gave my book that title, The Rage Against God.
I'm interested to hear you use the word idealist there, because I wonder if these new atheists, I wonder if part of the problem with them is the fact that they are driven by an absence of belief, just a negative, atheism, rather than by a presence of belief. So I wonder, is it right to call them idealists, or are they anti-idealists?
Well, it's a funny thing. In this argument, I've always made a very significant concession to my opponents. I say, I do not know. I cannot know that God exists. I think that belief is a choice. It involves faith. And my atheist opponents always pocket this concession quite cheerfully and say, oh, well, thank you very much. But they never see the implication of it, which is that their belief is also a belief. In fact, you quite often get it said, my belief is not a belief. And the default assumption of these people is that religious belief is so absurd that you have to make an effort to encompass it and to take it on, and that the default position of the human mind is atheism, and they don't need to argue in its favor, nor can they be classified as believers in anything. On the contrary, it seems to me that the belief that the universe is a huge random cosmic car crash without purpose or significance is one which involves quite a lot of intellectual effort, cannot be proven any more than the existence of God, and should be classified as a belief, and has powerful wellsprings in the human spirit. Why do people want to believe this? The most interesting question about the atheist versus religious debate has always seemed to me to be, why do people so much want there not to be a God? And it's the one subject they all seek most vigorously to avoid, particularly by shutting down the debate by saying, I don't actually need to justify or explain my belief. My belief is the default position of all mankind.
And do you think their rage is just against God, or do you think there's something here where they are raging against belief systems in general, or any overarching view which gives humanity a sense of purpose and mission?
Well, I think the problem is that purpose and mission also means restrictions on behavior. It also means absolute morality, which cannot be defied, and which, if you do defy it, you will face consequences, possibly cosmic ones. It also contains an acknowledgement of the possibility of the eternal, the thing which most thoughtful people are to some extent afraid of. If death is not the end, if our actions are measured in a scale different from the one which we like to use, then obviously the world is a very different place from if our actions can only be judged by the immediate effect that they have on us and the others that we can see, and also that we, when we finish our lives, cease entirely to exist and have no further significance. If eternity exists, if the human soul exists, everything is completely transformed. The world has a purpose. There is the possibility of justice. Now, everybody desires justice for other people, but they don't necessarily desire it for themselves. But in acknowledging its existence for other people, they have to recognize that it may come to them too. People don't like that. And I think the great similarity between Christian believers or any religious believers and atheists is that both fear that God exists. The difference between believers and atheists is that believers hope that he exists as well.
One thing that you've written about, and others have written about too, is the way in which these new atheist types express a contempt for humanity, in the sense that they see human beings as stupid and fickle, particularly religious human beings. And in a sense, religious people seem to have more faith in humanity today than humanists do. Is that something you found?
Well, I have always said, since I got involved in this debate, that my atheist opponents remind me of the most unpleasant, despicable and bumptious, arrogant person I ever knew, namely my own adolescent self. That there is this characteristic of huge intolerance. If I've learned one thing in decades in Fleet Street of travelling the world, of visiting 57 countries, of blundering into war zones, of seeing dead people and starving people and all the other things that I've seen and experienced, the one thing I've learned is that contempt for other human beings is the beginning of unwisdom. As soon as you start having total contempt for any other human creature, you're on the slippery slope to totalitarianism and murder. And it's something which everybody should avoid all the time. Never, ever cease to remember that we're all made in the image of God and that every single human being is valuable. But the furious, enraged contempt, which some atheists, though it tends not to be the ones which one meets in debate, but some atheists feel and express towards religious believers, is astonishing. And indeed, they will say things such as, actually, in this case, I believe in censorship. These people should not be allowed to bring their children up in their own faith. This faith is the equivalent of child abuse, and so on and so forth. Incredibly intolerant, dangerous, totalitarian statements, which they'd never make about any other subject, they make about religious belief.
So, in a sense, they ironically rehabilitate the intolerance of earlier religious eras, such as the Inquisition. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, they do. And immediately, if anybody says religion has behaved atrociously in the past and sometimes behaves badly in the present, I acknowledge it and say this is absolutely true. This, I believe, is not a fault of religion in itself. It's a fault in all men, that anybody who embraces a belief can take it too far. And the more powerful the belief, the greater the danger is, and the more you have to watch out for it. It's one of the reasons why the particular brand of Christianity which I've chosen is the Church of England, which is probably the most completely opposite to the dogmatic intolerance of the Marxist-Leninist position I used to take. And that's one of the reasons why it appeals so strongly. It's very, very hard, particularly these days, to imagine the Church of England launching a series of persecutions, burnings, or inquisitions. But it's quite easy to see the new atheists doing so at some point in the future. They have so much in common in their language and their methods of argument with the Bolsheviks, which they aren't aware of because they don't know the history of the Bolsheviks, and they don't know, amongst other things, just how specifically atheist the Bolsheviks were. But they have it in them, I'm afraid.
Where do you think atheism went wrong? Because if you look back to the earliest expressions of Enlightenment thought, I mean, they weren't all atheists by any stretch of the imagination, but the Enlightenment begins in many ways as a defence of religious freedom. If you look at John Locke on his letter on toleration, it's about defending the right of groups who do not subscribe to mainstream religions to express their beliefs. But now, those who would describe themselves as the heirs to the Enlightenment almost do the precise opposite of that.
Well, some of them do, and then you get very enlightened atheists such as Thomas Nagel, who are entirely willing to treat religious believers as reasonable beings and don't have this awful intolerant edge. It's a specific characteristic of a certain type of atheist. It isn't a necessary condition of being an atheist that you behave like this. And in fact, it's one of the points that I ceaselessly make in these discussions that I have. Why can't you be more like Thomas Nagel? Why is it that you can't simply accept that I believe what I believe, and that it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm stupid or malicious that I do? I'm quite prepared to accept that people have rejected the existence of God for what they believe to be sound reasons. I think it is a completely permissible intellectual position for an informed person to take. The choice between the two has always seemed to me to be ultimately a moral choice. What sort of universe do you wish to live in? And as I say, that's the subject that so few of them wish to discuss, whereas Thomas Nagel at least has asked this question: why is it that I so much want there not to be a God? I think that is a fascinating question.
And do you think the problem is the transformation of atheism into the starting point of political activism? Because in the past, atheism was very often just an accident in a sense, and people beyond being an atheist, they were a humanist or they were a communist or they were something else. Is it the transformation of atheism into the be-all and end-all of some people's identity which creates this intolerance you're talking about?
I think it's a result of this having been the last century, having been the century of politics, which is in itself a false religion. Time was when a ship sank or an earthquake destroyed a city or whatever it was that happened, people would blame God or think that it was visited on them by God as some sort of punishment. Now, whenever a major event happens of any kind, particularly a disastrous one, it immediately becomes political. People turn to the government. What's the government going to do about this? Why didn't the government prevent this? We have become worshippers of human power, and religion, particularly in the advanced Western countries, this is less true of the United States, but it's certainly true of Europe, pretty much died out after the First World War. And so the very idea that God plays a role in human life has been removed from most people's intellectual universe. So that's part of it. The other thing is that we have had an extraordinarily long period of, again, in the advanced Western world, not everywhere else by any means, of peace, freedom from war, and of extraordinary prosperity, when we've simply, and indeed of huge advances until the end of our lives in healthcare. So we're all healthier, we suffer less pain. Hardly anyone in the Western world even knows what hunger means. So we live at an immense remove from the experiences which caused most people to ponder the existence or non-existence of God in a serious way. So it is a world which encourages either atheism in the intellectual or a complete indifference towards the subject, which in my view is much more dangerous to religion anyway, a complete indifference towards the subject among millions of people who just think it doesn't matter and find it laughable.
Right. And do you think godlessness per se is a problem, or is it the absence of a faith in anything at all? I mean, I'm thinking if some of these atheists were genuine humanists, they had a positive attitude towards human beings' capabilities and their ability to transform their world, would that be okay? Or is the godlessness thing itself a problem?
When you say okay, and as far as I'm concerned, these things are permissible. I wouldn't seek to prevent anybody from following it. Whether it's okay for the immortal souls they don't think they have is another question. I would obviously, because I believe that I and they have immortal souls, would wish that they would live as if they did. But that doesn't mean that I want to persecute them into believing that. In the end, somebody who's interested in the subject is more likely to come to grips with the immense importance of whether there is a soul or not than somebody who's completely indifferent. I'd rather have atheists actively arguing against religious belief than people who are wholly indifferent to the idea.
And do you think there's a certain kind of animalism to modern-day atheism, because not only are they opposed to the idea of a soul and a spirit, but they talk about human beings as being effectively driven by their genes, being bundles of DNA, and nothing beyond that?
There's something extraordinarily determinist about this, isn't it? I think that is a natural human desire to avoid responsibility for our own actions. And the whole DNA made me eat too much, DNA made me break my marriage vows, DNA made me this, that, and the other is excuse-making as far as I'm concerned. People are free to take choices, though often it's much easier to take the easy and damaging choice than it is to take the hard and undamaging one. But we've known about the steep and rugged pathway for a very long time, haven't we? Obviously there's an element of that. I call it selfism. The principal worship of the modern Western person is the worship of the self. And making sure that the self is as indulged as possible. And here's the other thing, which I think is very important in this. I'm constantly told that the golden rule can exist without Christianity, and I say absolutely, Christianity is much, much, much deeper than the golden rule, because Christianity concerns God's knowledge of the soul and the inward parts of man. The golden rule, do as you would be done by, could equally well be described as appear to do as you would be done by. And anybody with any experience of office politics or indeed the maneuverings of human beings in almost all circumstances knows perfectly well that some of the most unpleasant people on the planet can appear to others to be extremely pleasant and charming and kind and nice, and that these are in some ways the most villainous of all. If there is no requirement of an inward goodness, then behavior can actually appear to be good. You can have a society in which there is a limited amount of common decency going on, but the fundamental obligations are not being fulfilled. And as a result, you have a much inferior form of society. But that, to some extent, is what people like. They can get away with it. If people think they're good, if they appear to be good, and if their lives are protected enough from the consequences of other people being wicked, that'll do it for them.
One thing you've challenged is this very lazy cliche that all conflicts are caused by religions and that religion is the source of war, the source of trouble. I wonder if you've changed your mind at all in relation to the rise of the Islamic State and what looks to most people like a quite explicitly religious conflict.
No. I'd never denied that religions can cause conflict, but so can other sorts of human belief. And the question is really making sense of what this means. Any strongly held belief can lead to conflict. Patriotism can lead to conflict. Marxist-Leninism can certainly lead to conflict. All kinds of other beliefs have done so. So any strongly held belief can. The question is whether the fault lies in the fact that it's a religious belief or whether the fault lies in the fact that men, unrestrained in their consciences, can behave badly in the belief that they're doing ultimate good. I think this is the real problem, that the most dangerous person in the world is somebody who believes that he's good. And that will always be the case, which is one of the reasons why I'm in favor of free, law-governed societies in which power is restrained and there are limits on what people can do. And the real problem is that in these circumstances, such as the Islamic State, there is no restraint on these people. Law and indeed public opinion and free press and all the other restraints on behavior have completely broken down. These people are absolute in their own territory.
A final question. Why do you think it is that atheists have found it so hard to replace God with anything else? I mean, Terry Eagleton refers to surrogate forms of transcendence, the attempt to find a new form of transcendence that is post-God, post-religion, which he says doesn't really work and is never very convincing. Why do you think that is?
Well, my view would be that there is no substitute, that either there is this immense, incomprehensible, eternal power, or there is not, and that if it doesn't exist, then we are terribly alone. And we're alone in ways which some people may find comforting, and that there's no justice for them. But if there's no justice for me, there's no justice for you either. And then where are we when we meet on a lonely road and I want what you have and you want what I have?
Peter Hitchens, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
That was Peter Hitchens of the Daily Mail, author of The Rage Against God, published by Continuum. On RN, you're listening to Counterpoint with me, Brendan O'Neill. Up next, a monologue by me on how humanists lost their faith in humankind.